I have had plenty of fun with Breath of the Wild thus far, I've found that there have been numerous issues plaguing the adventure, preventing it from engaging me from start to finish. The lack of a compelling narrative, side quests and menial tasks to complete, and dungeons that I find to be too lifeless to be alluring to me. Despite all this, I can remain hooked by the game and continue to enjoy exploring its environments and taking on its challenges, if it weren't for my biggest gripe of all, the combat loop. Combat is integral to so many games nowadays, and whether or not it is done correctly could spell demise for many titles. On the contrary, a great combat system can take a pretty ordinary game and boost its appeal to brand new heights. Games with combat at their core will live or die, depending on how it feels to take on foes, which is why the developers must focus on delivering robust systems that remain intriguing and enjoyable throughout the runtime of a game. I personally don't like Breath of the Wild's combat all that much, especially after playing the game for several hours. There are so many different aspects to consider when dissecting the game's combat system, but one of the most overlooked cogs in this machine is how it actually feels to engage in battle. When thinking about this, I asked myself a few pressing questions. Do my attacks feel as impactful as they should? Do the animations make sense for my character to be performing? Do enemies respond in ways that seem logical in the given circumstances? If you don't quite understand what I'm saying, let me use the Dark Souls series as an example, specifically the second and third games. In Dark Souls 3, digging your weapon into an enemy is grotesquely visceral just when it needs to be, while other times give more of a metallic, resonant vibe. These two responses can create different feelings within the player, and are great at reflecting how your weapon would actually respond in these situations. The violent clang of metal on metal usually connotes an ineffective strike, such as a weapon hitting a shield and doing meager damage as opposed to the squishy sound of a weapon cutting through flesh, which reflects a more potent attack. In contrast to this, Dark Souls 2 gets it all wrong in the sound design department. While I don't really know how to describe these sounds, it isn't at all pleasing to the ears, and in very few ways is indicative of the enemy you're taking on. Now, with these examples out of the way, how does it feel to fight in Breath of the Wild? Well, it's kind of all over the place. While the large weapons feel weighty and powerful to swing around, the spears leave a lot to be desired, with their flurry of attacks feeling ever so pitiful. The smaller weapons are somewhere in the middle, but to me outshine the other two in terms of balancing power and speed. Spears tend to be our weapon of choice in so many games, so having them feel so flimsy that it seems like they could break at any moment. Right. Durability. I'll get to that later. Sounds are pleasing enough to listen to, and powerful attacks are met with a similar striking din. Instead of a squishy noise akin to the likes of Dark Souls, they went with... While it may be a nice thing to hear, it does a poor job of attributing a realistic sound to the defeat of a foe. It simply makes no sense. Animations are pretty good, but I feel as if Link suffers too little after swinging a huge hammer. Despite all of this, it is wonderful to be able to hit an enemy so hard they get flung off of a cliff. The ragdoll physics are truly something to behold. So, if battle is presented this nicely, what exactly do I take issue with? Well, it just so happens that everything else tends to rub me the wrong way. One of the most egregious issues is the divisive durability mechanic. Durability systems can work, such as in Skyward Sword ironically enough, albeit they're usually wholly unnecessary and add little to the overall experience. In that game, only your shields can break, and assuming you both pay attention to the character's hints, for example, being warned about taking a wooden shield into a lava-soaked volcano, and figure out the proper timing for the shield bash, your shield is never going to break. You're rewarded for playing well rather than being punished for playing how you want to. On the contrary, Breath of the Wild's arsenal might as well be entirely made of glass. Am I supposed to believe that a claymore, after only a couple of rounds of combat, would break in such a spectacular fashion? Even the bows can shatter if used enough, which is utterly ludicrous. People have defended this by suggesting that Nintendo wanted to force you to use a wider variety of weaponry, but in a game respected for its ability to let people play however they want to, this is a contradictory defense. Here's what I think. Nintendo wasn't interested in balancing weapons in such a way that you'd be able to use most weapons effectively, instead opting to make all of the cool and powerful weapons completely disposable so players couldn't abuse them. At first, I restrained myself from using all of the special weapons I obtained since I knew how flimsy they'd be. At some point I got tired of holding onto things for what seemed like forever, and began to use my new toys all willy-nilly, eventually leading to me seeing each new weapon I picked up as an expendable tool for combat instead of a fresh and exciting weapon. You can't make me enjoy durability. I can live with it, but there's nothing inherently fun about it. However, what you can do is make it tolerable, which is antithetical to what happened in Zelda. I know, I just brought up Breath of the Wild as a lot of interesting weapons, but that's not entirely true. There are three primary types: the big ones, the little ones, and the long ones. Those are very broad descriptions, but I think they aptly describe the weapons. The big ones are slow, yet have powerful blows to compensate for their speed. These can come in the form of claymores and axes. The little ones do plenty of damage while not suffering in terms of speed, making them objectively the best choice of battle. These can come in the form of broadswords and boomerangs. The long ones are fast, but do pitiful amounts of damage. These can come in the forms of spears and more spears. When you find a big ol' hammer, you already know that its moveset is going to be identical to the big ol' sword you found earlier. This goes the same for each weapon type, with a couple of subclasses which change up the moveset somewhat. Boomerangs, rods, the Deku Leaf. I find this deeply disappointing. I hate to circle back to Dark Souls, although we all know that's not true, but picking up a weapon in that game which belongs in the same class as another means more than just some raw stat changes and elemental effects. Each and every weapon functions in its own way, even if sometimes only slightly. Something like this could have gone a long way in making the acquisition of new weapons more stimulating. Minor notes on the rods and boomerangs. I kinda wish the rods had a little more to them, but the fire rods are nice and devastating, so I can't complain too much. Making boomerangs a type of weapon instead of a utility item is one I'm not a huge fan of, as they lose what made them special in the previous games and now act more like arrows that come back, unless they're interrupted by an object or you fail to catch them. So they're actually sorta worse than arrows. Huh. Since my gripes with the weapons are out of the way, I can finally get onto what I perceive to be the biggest issue regarding combat in this game. The enemies. After playing Breath of the Wild for several hours, something can become quite apparent. There isn't a whole lot of monster variety, despite the expansive bestiary boasted by previous Zelda titles. Here we have bokoblins, moblins, and Lizalfos making up most of the game's encounters, followed by the likes of Choo-Choos and Kass, which randomly appear from time to time just to get in the way. Octoroks and Wizrobes also make an appearance from time to time, and that's it for returning enemies. As for the new ones, we have Lynels, a whole host of different guardians, members of the Yiga clan, and Pebblets. There are some overworld bosses in the bosses of each dungeon, but even with all this, the diversity here is severely lacking. With just 11 types of enemies to fill a huge open world with, how exactly did Nintendo do it? That's elementary, my dear Watson, as Nintendo decided to give every single enemy a whole host of different variations, ranging from giving them more health and damage to different attacks and patterns. This means that Nintendo can scale the difficulty of certain areas simply by reusing the same assets over and over, only bumping up arbitrary stat values to make them tougher opponents. To me, this made each consecutive confrontation less and less exciting, seeing as I was just fighting the same enemies over and over, albeit with minor differences. This hastily made my opinion of the game drop, as once the initial adrenaline of being thrust into a world such as this one had worn off, I found myself getting tired out when dealing with groups of enemies I'd already seen done many times before. When it comes to the harder versions of enemies, it can get a little ridiculous. At the start of the game, the blue bokoblins proved to be incredible threats, almost killing Link in one shot with his starting gear. On top of this, Link's damage is pitiful against them, highlighting one of Breath of the Wild's critical flaws: health. This goes both ways. The foes that you face tend to have way too much health while Link has way too little. Well, maybe Link not having enough health isn't accurate, as it's more so the fact that enemies do way too much damage. This sort of difficulty, if you can even call it that, is far too punishing for its own good. A single blow from a meager bokoblin of all things, even further into the game, can place Link on death's doorstep, where you then have to pause the game to stuff Link's face in order to replenish his health. This ruins the flow so greatly, with each unsuccessful dodge or block resulting in you having to break the flow of combat just to heal back up. This wouldn't be such an issue if enemies did less damage, but then people wouldn't praise it for being so tantalizingly difficult. Because this unreasonable damage is the only thing making death such commonplace during my time playing the game. As for the enemies' health bars, this can get absurd. Lynels are my least favourite foes to take on for a couple of reasons, the first being the amount of damage they do. But the second is how long they take to kill. It feels like such a lengthy process just to whittle their HP down, breaking several weapons in the process just to topple these tanks. It doesn't feel worth the effort past the first couple of times, and I simply ignore all Lynels I come across while travelling because I know how much of a pointless commitment it's going to be to tackle them. It really doesn't help that health bars are so small atop a monster's head, meaning that it can sometimes feel like you're not doing any damage seeing how slowly it goes down. To demonstrate what it feels like, here's a clip of Chugga Conroy one-shotting a Blissey in Pokemon Platinum. Bear in mind, this could be a lot longer if that Blissey was level 100, which is more akin to how battle feels in Breath of the Wild. While Lynels are bad and I hate them, do not get me started on the atrocity that is the major test of strength. This subset of trials should be renamed to the major test of patience, considering how long it takes to fell one of these Guardian Scouts. Ever try punching a brick wall? Well, if you haven't fought one of these before, go ahead and try that, as the experiences are similar in many ways. The first time I fought this thing was so very, very painful. Not only did I die in a single shot, but I literally had to break my entire arsenal of melee weapons while fighting it, on top of utilizing my bow to deal extra damage. I hate this design decision. No, I despise it. None of the enemies in this game deserve to last as long as this bot does, as their movesets have very little to offer after the first 30 seconds of the fight. I cannot believe so few are piped up about the preposterous health pools of Breath of the Wild's baddies, as it's the main thing keeping me away from the game. With all that said, it's time to close the book on this subject once and for all.